For the first half of cinema history, if you said horror movie, most people would picture gothic castles, mad science, and characters with menacing and vaguely Eastern European accents.
I like the dark. It's friendly.
Today, what they'd imagine is...
What, do you want to see my new chainsaw and hockey mask?
The shift in public perception happened in the late 70s and early 80s, most specifically with... Halloween wasn't technically the first slasher film, but its massive success did kick off the first teen slasher cycle. 80s horror has a reputation for being dominated by these kinds of movies, but in fact, there were two separate and distinct cycles of slasher flicks, nearly back to back. Something similar happened with superhero movies in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, which is why slashers can tell us a lot about the future of superheroes. First, I'll have to define what a cinematic cycle actually is. Put simply, it's an intensified burst of production of a certain type of film, usually a subgenre, over a very short period of time. In his book Blood Money, A History of the First Teen Slasher Cycle, Richard Noel outlines the stages of a cinematic cycle. It starts when filmmakers either try something new, which is pretty risky in the movie business, or they attempt to revive a style of film that hasn't been successful in a while. Of course, there are a lot of antecedents to Halloween, from Psycho to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Some, like Richard Noel, regard Black Christmas as the first fully developed slasher film. There is some dispute about whether John Carpenter and Deborah Hill even saw Black Christmas before writing Halloween, but it did come out first. Still, it wasn't particularly successful. Halloween was, and so Noel terms this a trailblazer hit. Next come the Prospector cash-ins. These are the movies that consciously copy the format of the Trailblazer, what most people would call a knockoff.
I thought of this title some time ago called Friday the 13th, and I said to myself, if I had a film called Friday the 13th, I could sell that.
And Sean called me up and said, Halloween is making incredible money at the box office, let's rip it off. That is keeping it real.
This strategy is riskier than it might first appear. At this point in a cinematic cycle, it's impossible to know if the Trailblazer's success is actually signaling audience interest or was merely a fluke. Take what happened after the Blair Witch Project. There was a small cluster of found footage horror films in the early 2000s, but none of them struck gold. A true cycle of found footage didn't really happen until about 7 or 8 years later. Because movies take a long time to make, there's usually a big gap between the Trailblazer's success and the first of the Prospector cash-ins. Halloween was released in 1978, and there were virtually no slashers in 1979, but by 1980 you couldn't get away from them. For a cycle to truly take off, one of these has to become a successful film in its own right, a reinforcing hit. Friday the 13th made $60 million off of a $500,000 budget, and that's 1980s dollars. Now we reach the final stage, the Carpetbagger cash-in. These are the uninspired sequels and low-effort rip-offs made by greedy hacks who, ironically, flood the market and ultimately kill the public's interest in the film type.
Fog, Terror Train, Prom Night. How come Jamie Lee Curtis is in all of these movies?
She's the scream queen.
It's rare, however, for a genre or style to disappear entirely from theaters, especially one as cheap as slashers. They instead return to a base level of production, which can range from a few films a year, like slashers, or one every few years, like musicals, depending on the average cost of that type of film. Nearly a dozen slashers came out in 1981, but 82 and 83 saw only 2 apiece. The slasher genre seemed to have run its course, until... another hugely successful cycle of slasher films, this time with supernatural villains, lasted until the end of the decade. At that point, the horror pendulum swung in the opposite direction towards classier fare, like Bram Stoker's Dracula and the Oscar-winning Silence of the Lambs. Some people try to claim that Silence is a thriller, not a horror movie, but come on, a dude wears another dude's face as a mask. It's a horror movie. But the slasher genre had made such an indelible mark on the public consciousness that in 1996, teenagers who hadn't even been born when the original Halloween came out could not only understand, but thoroughly enjoy a scene like this.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex. Big no-no! Big no!
I'm a dead man.
Sex equals death, okay? Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. No, the sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of number one. And number three, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
You see, you push the laws and you end up dead. Okay, I'll see you in the kitchen with a knife.
Thus, Scream began a new cycle of meta-horror slasher films in the late 90s, and even that subgenre has a certain base level of production, popping up every few years. From the late 70s to the early 2000s, slasher movies dominated the horror field, kinda like how superhero movies dominated the last 2 decades of blockbuster cinema.
Is this about the Avengers? Which I know nothing about.
Superheroes have been in the movies almost as long as they've been in comic books. Some have been huge hits,
I'm Batman.
but none really kicked off a successful cycle of superhero films until 2000's X-Men finally showed someone other than Batman or Superman could produce a hit. Just like slashers in the year following Halloween, there were virtually no comic book superhero movies in 2001. But in 2002, Spider-Man became the reinforcing hit, the first film to ever earn $100 million in its opening weekend, demonstrating that superhero movies would stick around for a while. What made these different than previous superhero movies was, I think, 2 things. First, an effort to be serious. The filmmakers attempted to address real-world issues, either directly or metaphorically.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
Second, and perhaps relatedly, the studios got in the habit of hiring independent and foreign directors to helm their movies, people like Bryan Singer, Sam Raimi, and Ang Lee. Some of these were, naturally, more successful than others. The apotheosis of this style of superhero film probably came in 2008 with The Dark Knight, the highest-grossing superhero movie up until that point, and still regarded as a high watermark of the genre. Also in 2008, another film appeared to fit neatly in the serious superhero mold, an origin story about a weapons manufacturer kidnapped by terrorists in Afghanistan. There was one difference, though.
Mr. Stark, you become part of a bigger universe. I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
Paired with The Incredible Hulk, this marked a new style of film, the cinematic universe. The serious superhero films followed a reliable pattern. If the first one was good, the studio gave the filmmakers a lot of leeway, and the sequel would be even better. But by the time the third film rolled around, overzealous studio demands, career moves, and real-life tragedies intervened, ending the trilogy on a sour note.
When you get to a part 3, I did not coin this term, but somebody coined the term Threequelitis, because you can go through various film series and see where part 3s didn't work. So you make the note to self, if we're ever lucky enough to get to a part 3, we're not going to succumb to that. And it really was about saying, once you get that far into a series, the audience is saying, we're with you, we like these characters. They're not saying, we want exactly more of the same. They're saying, we want to spend more time with these characters. That's what I wanted.
The cinematic universe was different. What even counts as the third film after Iron Man? If you included The Incredible Hulk, it would be Iron Man 2. Or there's The Avengers, which mostly centered on Iron Man as the main protagonist. Iron Man 3 is the 7th film in the MCU.
It would make sense if this were just a sequel. But we're not in a sequel, because nobody just makes sequels anymore. We're in a franchise, and there are certain rules to a continuing franchise.
I had a feeling.
I would argue that these films can't be regarded separately, but rather in groups, or as Marvel refers to them, phases.
I loved sequels. I love franchise films. I never felt any cynicism towards them the way the press did when I was a kid, and I think still do.
The worst part is, franchises are just continuing episodic installments designed to boost an IP.
Just like in 1979 and 2001, there were no shared universe films in 2009, unless you want to count X-Men Origins Wolverine, but that's a spin-off, which isn't exactly the same thing. In fact, you couldn't really say the MCU was definitively a shared universe until the separate heroes came together for the Avengers. It was only at that point that competing studios started attempting to create genuine shared universe films, most of which failed from the start. Because these sorts of huge budget productions take so long to make, the serious superhero films stuck around for a little while longer, overlapping with the cinematic universe cycle. Some of them adapted themselves into this new cycle. in the same way that Jason went from being a big guy with a machete to an undead killing machine. The superhero universe cycle differs from almost every other cycle in film history, in that it's mostly been maintained by one successful series. Since 2010, the highest-grossing superhero film of every year has been a part of the MCU. A few carpetbaggers have been reinforcing hits, and so hope springs eternal in the breast of studio executives is that someday they too will make their own cinematic universe.
Hope. Let me tell you something, my friend. Hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can drive a man insane.
I doubt superhero movies will ever truly go away at this point, but the enthusiasm for superhero universes seems to be teetering on a precipice. Some people will say it's not superhero fatigue, but bad movie fatigue, and in a sense, I agree. The same could be said of Jason Takes Manhattan. Superhero budgets keep increasing, while the box office remains flat or even declines in some cases. But again, unlike slashers, these massively budgeted films take years to make. Just like it took several years for carpetbaggers to cash in on the success of the MCU, it'll take several more before they realize the audience has moved on. It's unlikely we'll get another year like 2001 until at least after Marvel has released Secret Wars. Superhero films won't go away any more than slasher films have. They'll simply return to a base level of production. There will always be a new Batman or Spider-Man under the mask, just like there's another Ghostface. And for a while, blockbusters will be dominated by another style. Video game adaptations look like a good bet. But if someone finds a way to make superheroes interesting again, you can expect a lag of at least a year before the competitors try to cash in on this new innovation. And only if one of those succeeds will there be an explosion of copycats like we've been seeing for the last 20 years. It's going to be X-Men again, isn't it? If you liked this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more of these kinds of videos, hit the subscribe button. And if you want your friends to know what great taste you have in video essays, hit the share button. For further information, including sources and a list of films used in this video, visit TooMuchFilmSchool.com.